Hi, I'm Harrison, and thanks for joining us. We have another lecture from Zarlenga's Law, Science, Money to cover, and talking about the history of Western civilization from the standpoint of how money gets made. Before we dive into that, let's warm up a little bit. This is the Monetary History Calendar. This is a really great resource that works in conjunction with Law, Science, of Money. This gives you little anecdotes, important stories from monetary history, and there's some interesting stuff going on here. You know, in 1009 BC, King Solomon was born, son of David, quoted saying, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender." Proverbs of Solomon 7:22. I'm pretty sure King Solomon also said that cannabis is the herb that would heal all nations as well. A very wise man, knew a lot about debt and cannabis. Anyhow, something else that I wanted to draw your attention to here from the Monetary History Calendar. The War of 1812. Little kind of very understudied war in American history, kind of an interesting one. I remember we were watching Conan a couple nights ago, you know, just the YouTube clips, and Conan was playing a video game with Will Arnett, I think it was. Will Arnett's Canadian, and you know, they're talking smack to each other over some stupid game, and you know, Will Arnett pointed out that the last time the United States and Canada got into a war, Canada won, you know, referring to the War of 1812, which he talked about, and it's just interesting. You know, I hope we have more of an international audience. I hope we have some Canadians online, friends from Canada. But the War of 1812 probably gets a bigger place in Canadian history than it does here in United States history, because you know, that was when the White House got burned down. James Madison had, you know, fled the White House, and his wife saved like a lot of relics and stuff from the White House. But this war is interesting from a monetary perspective as well, and I can't wait to get to the American history portion of these lectures. That's when this stuff is really going to heat up, and I hope that's when we're going to get more comments and questions coming in. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. The more questions you type in, it doesn't matter if you think that they're stupid or like whatever. Just the more questions you have, please leave them in the comments section, and let's expand this conversation. I hope that some of this stuff is rubbing off on you, and I hope that you're talking about some of this stuff with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and of course your enemies, because that's how this changes. That water cooler effect is what we need to take hold of, and to talk about that more later. But back to the War of 1812 real quick. This war, we're going to see in the chapter on Renaissance, that we say that money is the sinew of war. We say that all wars are bankers' wars. And so the Revolutionary War was funded with sovereign, interest, debt-free currency, the continental currency. And the United States, the early United States government just spent this money directly into existence on materials for war. But the War of 1812 was a different example. This was done with debt bonds, which helped the bankers make money. And so we can see how the banking system more than likely caused this war, and we're going to look at that more when we get into the War of 1812 and that part of history in the 19th century. So Thomas Edison would later say about the kind of treasury bonds that were used to fund the War of 1812. If our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. Dollar bonds are basically what we have now. The Federal Reserve owns them. What we want, what we're fighting for, are dollar bills. And Edison said that element that makes the bond good makes the bill good. So that's from the Monetary History Calendar. Please check this out. Please subscribe to it, get updates from it, get emails from it on a regular basis. It's great stuff. And then back to our home base, Greens for Monetary Reform. So let's move on with a little review, catch up on the story thus far. Started a little bit before the 40th century, 4000 BC. This coincided with the Great Plow Revolution. And the plow, of course, made agriculture possible. Agriculture, helped create the metropolitan centers that were necessary for major commerce to take effect. And what we see in the ancient cities, the ancient Oriental cities like Samaria, Egypt, etc., specifically Samaria, we see that the clay tablets were used to record transactions. And so these clay tablets, they were recording perhaps monetary exchanges, but moreover, they were recording animal and seed exchanges. What we see, around 4000 BC is that money is alive. It's based on cattle or seeds. In one case, tools would also be used as money as well. Tool money was also very common and exchanged and used as currency. Money was more alive than it is now. And so what would happen is, because cows can reproduce, and because seed kernels can make more seeds, it would be common to return some of the bounty of that harvest. It would be common to return some of the cow's offspring or some of the seed from the harvest to your neighbor, or to the temple that you borrowed your money from. And so those clay tablets were used as forms of debt. Really interesting book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber talks a bit more about the anthropology of this. Basically what we see is that there was no such thing as a society without some form of money. Money didn't have the same social significance that it has in our day and age, but what we see is that anything could be used as money. And David Graeber's book does a good job of showing how different things could be used, like rusty nails or cowrie shells, or wampum, and in some cases beads. It didn't necessarily have the same use as money does today, but it was a means of exchange. And this goes to show something that Aristotle would write about in the 4th century, which is that money exists by law, not by nature. Money doesn't exist because it's related to the value of some commodity. That's totally abstract. Money is something that exists when you get a bunch of human beings together. It's something that arises naturally, just like math or music or something like that. Money is a form of exchange. It's a form of communication. The Federal Reserve's private ownership of our monetary system is just as stupid as, it's almost dumber than, say, like Merriam-Webster owning the English language and charging our government a tax on each citizen for using language. It's an idea. It's backed by law. It's not something material, which is a major error that started around 1500 to 1000 BC in the Greek city-states. We start to see the monetization of gold, and this is done predominantly within the Greek temples. Remember the movie 300, where Leonidas has to go climb that mountain and go talk to the oracle at Delphi, who have like the temple seer girls who were basically prostitutes. And Zarlenga speculates that prostitution played a major role in the monetization of gold as well. One other thing that we know for a fact played a really big role in the monetization of gold was the early tourism industry. People traveled in antiquity. They had more time to travel than we do now. They got to travel farther, they got to take their time, they got to see more, they got to sample more of the food along the way. This whole notion that we're living in a better era falls apart completely once you start to understand this history, which is why we need to share this history. We need to show the people that different world is not only possible, but like right underneath our fingertips. So, pilgrimage, this was the early form of tourism, and it happened a lot in the ancient world. And these ancient priests, these ancient temples encouraged it, just like in the movie 300. He's telling Leonidas not to fight. Just honor the Carnea, honor this festival that was happening. And that's why you could only go with 300 men. And a lot of slaves, hundreds and hundreds of slaves who don't get mentioned in those wars, the Persian Wars. So, this causes lots of problems in ancient Greece, the monetization of gold. One thing that we see happening is, it's called the usury. This is very important. Usury starts around this time. And what this is it was common to give back animals or seed that were loaned out. Money is sterile, it's barren. Money can't have sex with itself in order to make more money. So this whole idea that if you give money out, you should be able to get more money back is known as the usury error, or just usury, plain and simple. And we see that starting around 1500 to 1000 BC. And I talked about a play, Antigone, in a previous lecture. It's you see awareness of the gold exchange, which we're going to talk about more. The central mechanism of exchange that was moving things around. The pre-runner to the central bank, the Federal Reserve System that we have now, was the exchange between silver and gold between East and West. And the priests typically controlled this trade at first. Trade slipped from different hands across history, but right at this time, we're talking about the priests have control over it. And so what happens is we see that the silver to gold ratio is lower in the East. It's lower the closer we get to India and Asian nations, and it's higher. So it's like it's typically around 6 or 7 to 1 in the East, and then higher, like as high as 12, 13 silver pieces to 1 gold piece in the West. And so what we see is lots of silver, along with timber and slaves and other things, being shipped east to the Orient, to Asia, and then we see the gold, the perfume, the silk, the luxury goods coming east to west. And similarly, we see pilgrims moving, from east to west. So, but this caused a lot of problems. The bankers caused a lot of wars back in antiquity, just like they did now. Wars between city-states. Gold would be hoarded in one city or another, causing shortages, causing all kinds of calamity. There would be all kinds of wars within cities, civil wars. This was the theme of Antigone. This is how this started, with the descendants of Oedipus fighting over control of Thebes. And then, of course, two brothers kill each other in a civil war. The traitor Polynices is left to rot on the battlefield. Antigone, the original anarchist, she decides to bury him in order to send him down to Hades. This pisses off Creon, who puts his law above the law of the gods. Money being another example of law of the gods. And then this family strife resembles the bigger civil war. And everyone's looking to the gods for guidance. Creon won't relent. Hammon, his son, who's supposed to marry Antigone, asks him to relent. Creon's wife asks him to relent, and just doesn't listen. Keeps blaming everyone of being driven by money, and we see references to this East-West gold standard. He talks about, he tells Tiresias, the blind prophet, who comes to tell him to allow the body of Polynices to be buried and to allow Antigone to live because the public agrees with her. And Creon accuses Tiresias, the blind prophet, who helped save Thebes from the curse of the Sphinx, and who shows up, of course, in the Odyssey and Iliad. There's always Tiresias. Creon tells Tiresias to go to India to make money off the gold trade, rather than off of religious chicanery. So we see the connection between religion and commercialization even in this play. It's a great example. And so much like the gods sort of hovering over all the drama in this play, we see this East-West gold exchange referenced by Sophocles within his play, sort of hovering over all this drama. So, 8th century BC, the 700s, this becomes important because Lycurgus, the great lawgiver who is off traveling, probably the Orient, comes back to Sparta to clean up town. And what he does, consults the oracles in accordance with them, and he sets up the Pelennor system of money that they use. These were watered down iron bars coated in vinegar, and this eliminated a lot of need for any kind of crime. So now that money was readily available, the land was distributed evenly among everybody in ancient Sparta. There's really good documents in this class materials section here about how Sparta had better food than any other city-state in ancient Greece. Really interesting stuff, and of course they had the best military system. The whole reason that they had this monetary system of sovereign currency, these Pelennors, this nomisma, was to back their military. And they talk about how this money, this freely available money, meant that the men had all the time that they needed to train, to stay fit, to stay in shape, to manage their slaves who did all their work for them, the helots. Never forget that. But this worked really well for them for about 3.5 centuries. Also, a little bit later in the 8th century, we see King Numa of ancient Rome. He was born maybe 30 years just after Lycurgus died. So this knowledge must have been around still. And King Numa was a descendant of a Spartan colony, the Sabines. And he most likely gained this knowledge of sovereign currency or nomisma through ancient Spartan tradition. And King Numa was a very religious figure, very focused on organizing his society, creating calendars and time systems, also known for organizing people of the city according to trade and to occupation, the beginning of what Durkheim would call the organic division of labor, I guess you could say, for the sociologists joining us. And this was the beginning of the Roman Republic. This was the real strength of the Roman Republic. The King Numa created bronze nomisma, similar to the iron Pelennors of ancient Sparta. This was non-commodity money. Like, this was money that was basically worthless. It was just a means of exchange. And this became the strength of the Roman Republic, and it lasted for a long time. So, the splendor of Rome, the stability of Rome, began to end with the Second Punic War. This is the 3rd century BC, and this is when Hannibal was trampling around Rome with the elephants, gobbling up all of this bronze money from ancient Rome, using it to fund assaults against Rome. And so this is when Rome abandons that currency and starts using silver denarius, and eventually, later on down the road, gold. And this creates more and more problems for ancient Rome. Even after the Punic War ended, this locked ancient Rome into an endless cycle of conquest. We see the same thing happening with ancient Sparta, too. I believe it ended when they picked fights with Athens and elsewhere, and they started focusing on building a navy, and that's when they started using gold and silver as opposed to their iron Pelennors. Similar situation in Rome. This is why Stephen Zarlenga was very, very adamant about making sure people pay attention to monetary policy in times of war. The bankers typically use war as a trick to mess up a stable monetary system. That's usually when they'll slip emergency monetary powers that benefit banks. And we're going to see that again during the Renaissance. I know there's a long intro, but it's important to remember all these major monetary kind of facts. So, ancient Rome is now stuck on silver and gold. This forces them into endless cycles of conquest because gold and silver needs to be ripped out from the earth. It needs lots of labor to do this, therefore slaves are required as well. So this is when monetary systems becomes an environmental issue, and this is when it becomes an issue of oppression as well. Sovereign currency is better for the environment as opposed to a commodity-based form of money. Now it's not gold or silver, now it's oil. We still see the earth getting destroyed in order to make our money. And in order to stop the destruction of our earth, we have to change the way our money gets made. So, this new silver and gold system worked for ancient Rome all the way through Caesar's pre-empire civil war period, 1st century BC, from like 60 to 40 BC. And Rome is using Caesar's silver and gold coinage system until quite a while. But another important thing happens in 331 AD. Capital of the Roman Empire moves from Rome to Byzantium, and this is important for a lot of reasons. You can see how the silver-gold east-west mechanism is playing out here. Byzantium, same region as Troy from the Iliad. So every several centuries we see these massive centralizations of gold and metal and silver, coin, going east. And the other thing that happens with the move of this capital is that the position of the Pontificus Maximus, which is the forerunner of the Pope position we have now, this was the most powerful position in the Roman Empire. The Pontificus Maximus had the prerogative to coin gold. Other kings could coin silver, but they could not coin gold. They couldn't make the gold coin. Gold bullion would have to be sent to the Pontificus Maximus in order for that to get made, it's my understanding. And they also were able to regulate the east-west exchange rate between gold and silver. They had other powers as well, such as setting calendars and important dates and holidays and so forth. So this position of Pontificus Maximus, it moves from Rome over to Byzantium, to Constantinople. And the position is for Pontificus Maximus is now called the Basileus. And it stays there for several more centuries. In 742 to 814 AD, that's the lifespan of Charlemagne. He was born in 742, died in 814 AD. So we're talking late 8th century, early 9th century. We always sort of see the interesting stuff happening around the turn of the century. These major figures who seem to pop out. And Zarlenga talks about how Charlemagne's era was a false dawn. I remember in high school they talked about how Charlemagne ended the Dark Ages. He didn't. He just made the Dark Ages even darker. His monetary system consisted of gold, silver exchange, mostly silver again, going east, and along with slaves. A lot of warfare, a lot of conquest, and this helped out Byzantine though. This is why the Basileus, this helped out Rome. This helped out Byzantine as well. He was the military might that allowed this empire to continue to exist against the expansion of the forces like the Turks. So, Venice, more so than Charlemagne, prepared the path for the Renaissance. Venice, this is the early 8th century AD, was able to tap into the silver-gold exchange rate mechanism. They were able to start trading directly with Muslims without having to deal with Constantinople. They ignored Byzantine's prohibition on trading east. They were small enough to pull it off at the time, but then they got really powerful. They grew a really big fleet of ships, which was essential for trading. Again, Venice was very militant. They had rowers and archers on the ships. Again, showing that correlation between military and monetary kind of literacy. And the thing about Venice, though, is that they managed to tap into the exchange between silver and gold. So they managed to send things like silver, slaves, timber, iron, raw materials east, and the east sends the luxury goods, the gold, the spices, the perfumes, the silk cloths, and the drugs, the opiate, perhaps some cannabis, to the west. So, again, we see some common awareness at the higher echelons of society of this east-west trading mechanism between gold and silver. But the real lost science of money is in the nomisma. Venice kind of introduced a silver coin that it wasn't overvalued enough to be nomisma, though. It was very cautiously introduced. Zarlenga writes more about that. But Venice became critical in the Crusades, which began in 1095. They joined the Crusades late because Venice was doing great business with the Muslims, making lots of profit on their silver, and but eventually they joined. With the Crusades, we also see the rise of the Knights Templar we talked about. Their supposed purpose was to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land, and maybe they did some of that, but that doesn't explain how they owned pretty much all of Europe, all the governments, all the monarchies of Europe within like about a year of their formation. And Zarlenga speculates that they managed to tap into this east-west silver-gold exchange. And what would happen is you'd have pilgrims in the west who would go check out stuff in the east, like Jerusalem, the Holy Land. Maybe they go further. So they wouldn't want to carry money on them because that would make them more susceptible to robbery. So the Templars would basically issue traveler's check. They would take silver. The pilgrims, they could get a check or a bill. They could redeem that for gold. Later on down the road in their journey when they get to the spot where they want to spend it. And this is how the Templars made a lot of money and learned a lot of financial innovations that we still use today. Traveler's check just sort of being one example. So, the other event that we covered was the fall of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. The Crusades were supposedly about taking back the Holy Lands. So the First Crusade didn't work because when the Christians got there, the Muslims treated them really well. They had a higher standard of living. They were outnumbered. A lot of the First Crusaders would intermarry in. Like, they didn't see a reason to retake the Holy Land, so that didn't work. The other Crusades, this isn't my specialty in history, but by the time of the Fourth Crusade, there was a secret plan to attack Constantinople, which is why Zarlenga is more or less speculating that the real purpose of the Crusades was about this monetary power. It wasn't really about religion, much like the current crusade we have in the Middle East now. Still all kinds of war over there, and it's all very much driven by our modern central banking system. And so it's very important to study the Crusades in more depth than I'm even going over in order to understand where we are now. Same story, different century, different form of commodity-based money that should be money by law. So Venice's fleet under the blind leader Dodge D'Anerico, who's blinded by forces in Constantinople. They took the ships. They took all the knights of Europe who were forced into doing this by the Pope, Pope Innocent the second, I believe. He was going to tax all these knights if they didn't go, and no one wanted to go on this Fourth Crusade, and it took them well over a year to sail all the way to Constantinople. Sorry, I'm losing it. And by the time they got there, when they got there and they realized what they were there to do, plunder the city, steal the silver and the metal, they were like, hey, why not? So it was Christian on Christian. In the fall of Constantinople in 1204, this basically redistributes all this silver, all this gold that had been sent east, and it brings it back to Europe. It brings it back to Western Europe. And this sets the stage for the Renaissance, which is where we're finally ready to start talking about now. And it's a lot of history to throw at you right now. That's just the review. We haven't even gotten into tonight's lecture yet. But before I go on, I just want to remind you that this is highly censored history. This is just grassroots history. Stephen Zarlenga was just a regular worker in the financial sector who had a hard-on for history, more or less, and who started putting this together over the course of his life. This book needs to be vetted by other academics. It's a very controversial book, which is what makes it so fun to read. But I'm trying to raise more awareness for this book, not just for the sake of enjoying history, which we are doing and we're going to continue to do, but also because this book supports a very clear piece of legislation called the National Emergency Employment Defense Act. And this piece of legislation was drafted by Dennis Kucinich and his wife Elizabeth Kucinich, who read this book, and they believed in it so much that they got this bill written, passed through judicial review. It's there, it exists, there's no time, it doesn't expire, we just got to get it reintroduced into Congress, and we have a lot more work to do. I mean, a lot more fun work to do to get that done. By we, I mean myself, my partner Natalie's behind the camera, and a lot of other friends who are here in New York, and who are across the country near different different Federal Reserve branches and other central banks across the world. There are more and more people starting to understand the problem of our debt-based currency and our central reserve system. Usually we talk, so the reason why I wouldn't be asking you for your money if it weren't for the fact that this is to support a very real solution. This is all adding up towards a people's bailout and a Green New Deal. The bill that we are fighting, that we are teaching this history to raise awareness for, is going to create universal health care, universal housing. It's going to create livable wages. It's going to create new job investment, creating a green new energy infrastructure in this country. Fully funded political elections. No more need to investigate Trump's Russian connections. Whatever else we need as well. This means the end of any debt, medical, housing, credit card, students, which is why I'm doing this. And this probably means the end of all our utility bills as well. This is not some far-off, far-fetched scheme. Had I known about the NEAT Act back in 2011, when it got introduced about a week before Occupy Wall Street started, I can guarantee you I would not be here live streaming asking you for money right now. And I guarantee you would have more than enough right now as well. I am fighting for an end to our money problems. And this, like Henry Ford said, it is well and good that the people of this nation don't understand our monetary system, for if you did, Henry Ford feared that there would have been a revolution overnight. And that's what's going to happen. It's going to be a slightly slow build, But the more people that become aware of this stuff and start talking about this history and this Build and Need Act, the quicker we're all going to get all the money we would ever need. We're not going to have to worry about money again. And it's going to happen fairly soon. The only thing holding me back right now, quite honestly, is my commitment to school. I'm finishing my dissertation at the New School for Social Research. It's long overdue. I've been there way too long. But the research skills that I've learned from the New School obviously help me put these lectures together, and it helps me deliver this information to you. It takes a lot of time to study this stuff. It takes a lot of energy to do the social media work. And we're in survival mode right now. Like, we've got all kinds of problems for the friends. We've been following us for a while, who know of our past history and stuff. You know that we're coming out of a really difficult time right now. But we've just got to make it a couple more weeks. We've got a lot of plans to expand our audience. We're not going to be relying on friends and family so much for a lot of these donations anymore. And thank you very much for those of you who donated. We've just cracked the $1,000 mark on our People's Money Genealogy Money campaign. It's pretty crazy to see. Just $1,035 already. Thank you all so much for keeping myself alive and for helping me move forward. I just need a little bit more money to get my phone back on. If we can get a donation at some point tonight, that would be a big help. Every little bit helps. Thank you also to the people who share out this lecture, just the moral support, just talking about it, just showing your friends that this is something that you would pay for if you had the cash to do it. That helps a lot too. And again, this is history that you're not going to get in any graduate, any undergraduate, or any high school setting, and that's why I'm doing this. But it's going to get bigger. We have a public conversation about the lost science of money, and as well about how to start a bigger movement within the university system. I want to start conversations at the New School about this book and about the bill, and ultimately I want the faculty and the administration of the New School to endorse the National Emergency Employment Defense Act as a solution to the student loan aspect, specifically of the economic crisis, as well as all the housing and other poverty issues that students have to deal with. But if I can get my school, if I get the New School to do that, I'm hoping that would set off a chain reaction and get other universities all across the country to endorse this piece of legislation and create the political pressure that we need to get this done. So this history that we're doing right now, this is really just a prelude. This is just the Hobbit, to the upcoming epic Lord of the Rings type struggle that we have against the Fed, which is like our Mount Doom up in Mordor. So we have a lot of work to do, but this is just the beginning. It's going to be a lot of fun. And with that, we can finally get to the Renaissance. My intros are getting longer and longer and longer as the history goes forward. But, yeah. So, monetary struggles during the Renaissance. So, again, fall of Byzantium in 1204, and this marked the passing of Caesar's monetary system, which had lasted for over 1,200 years. And now we see the money power slipping from religious control, the Pontificus Maximus, the Basilius. Now it's going to secular control. But none of them could quite harness it. None of the Prince, the Templars, none of them could fully reassert it. And so now we start to see a struggle for monetary control. Some other stuff that was going on, this is basically the end of the Dark Ages. The church held a near monopoly on literacy, on accounting and capital. The churches were basically the banks during the Dark Ages. The Christian church, just like the pagan Greek temples, were BC. This was a highly rural society as well in Europe during the Dark Ages. Towns typically held less than 1/10 of the population. For the bourgeois class, the owner class, the middle class between, the aristocracy, the country population was heavily exploited, just as they are now. Basically, there was a rentier class, a class of people that just rented out property to poor people, exactly like we have now. We're living in a $1 million rentier style home here in Bushwick, Brooklyn. These homes made out of $1 million just create out of nothing, and they expect a lot of this money back. Landlords expect real blood, real sweat, real tears. They have to get paid so they can pay off their mortgages, and it all goes back up to the Fed in our society. So, a lot of these bourgeois class, they didn't even have trade, they just became renters. And we also start to see labor starting to become a little bit more specialized and efficient in towns. And this ties up with the development of trade during the Renaissance and the advances in trade. Have you ever been to a Renaissance fair? Like I did when I was a kid. It's good dork fun, good food, cool things to buy, great tradition that's still with us today as well. It's probably a little bit different now though. But the principal method promoting trade were the great fairs sponsored by the territorial princes from the 11th century. And fairs were held annually or quarterly, depending on the importance. And the biggest one was in Champagne, organized by the Count de Champagne, probably made Champagne, who was also a member of the Knights Templar organization before it got suppressed in 1300 something. So these fairs were a free trade zone. There were no taxes at these fairs. Disputes arising outside the fairs were set aside, and regulations on trading were lifted, and merchants were attracted from afar with their wares in gold and silver coin. So these trade fairs were a means of clearing payments between merchants and vendors. The main monetary feature of these events was a payment clearing mechanism where merchants' purchases and sales were matched and accounts were settled at the end of the affair. If a merchant sold more goods than he bought, he would receive the difference in coinage. If he bought more than he sold, he would pay the difference. If his credit was good, he could extend a debit to be paid at the next fair. Usually, coin was expected in these pairs, but the fair at Champagne actually even issued its own token currency just for use at that fair, and this reached its height from 1250 to 1300 onward. What this shows, according to Raymond D. Hoover, not only the Dark Ages were a lot more sophisticated than we think they are, especially monetarily. We're going to see that a lot of the beginnings of modernity, what sociologists would call modernity, a lot of the beginnings of the later industrial revolutions are starting now with what we call bank money, which we're going to get to in a second. So the Middle Ages weren't really as primitive as we thought. It is not true that there was no planning, no intelligent direction, and no adequate accounting control. It was impossible to conduct medieval business in a haphazard fashion. Competition was strong, and profit margins were so small that merchants were forced to weigh their decisions. The chief fallacy which pervades most of the work on money in the Middle Ages is the mistaken notion that money of account was some kind of ideal or imaginary money, which was used as a basis of the valuation of real coins. So they used real money at these fairs. It wasn't credit money. It wasn't bank money yet. That's important. These monetary systems of these fairs were pegged directly or indirectly to gold and silver. They were based either on real coin or on a coin which had ceased to circulate but which still represented a definite weight of gold or silver. The other important activity during the Renaissance, besides these fairs, even bigger business, was war. These princes had to raise money for their wars. So the rulers used their money to hire mercenaries on a scale never known before during this period. And the rulers used their money as incomes as security loans from the bankers for even larger armies. So now huger armies are getting amassed. Pecunia nervis bellum, money as the sinew of war, was a primary aspect of this period. In the 1200s and 1300s, military service became a profession, professionalization, and in the 1400s it required skillful direction and large capital, carried on mainly by Swiss, German, and Spanish mercenaries. Wars raged most of the time. When not at war, soldiers often turned to banditry. The cost of maintaining armies was large, of course, as it is now. Money would have to get raised quickly. And of course, the technology is getting more and more expensive for these wars. The growth of firearms during this period and cannon, this is rendering the castles of the Dark Ages increasingly obsolete. And so now credit is starting to fuel this expansion in war. A city's credit rating rights, Zarlenga, became its most powerful weapon. The cities had an advantage over the princes, for until the 16th century, a prince's debt was not binding upon his successor, and the princes could not be foreclosed upon. Cities with perpetual existence were considered safer to lend to for the bankers. The aristocracy could come and go, but a city itself would receive money for weapons, basically. Any questions or comments at all or anything so far?
I love the illustrations that come with all this. These are really great.
Yeah, this is really cool artwork in this time period. Also talking about war during the Middle Ages, really interesting style of martial arts called historical European martial arts. A lot of the techniques and things that were used are still done for recreational purposes. And I'd like to do some of that on Front of Fed if possible. But moving on, talking about the king's mint and the prince's control of the money, whereas before Basilius or the Pontificus Maximus had control over the coinage of gold, now kings have the ability to do it. And in England and France, Germany, all over Italy, we see kings, princes creating their own money. And so these princes needed revenue, mainly for their wars. Most of the money was in the hands of the clergy, the noble, who were difficult to tax. And so the result is that the mints became a major source of revenue through the form of currency depreciation. So putting less of the good stuff, less of the silver, less of the gold, mostly silver is what's getting depreciated. So they would mix the silver down with some other metal, like copper or tin or something like that. So they would stretch the metal out. They put more silver, less silver and more coins, hype the value up. And so from mid-1300s to mid-1400s, this is been labeled a period of kingly abuse of the monetary power. The kings considered the coinage merely as one of their most valuable sources of revenue. From reign to reign, the quality of the coins issued become baser. Ordinance after ordinance was issued calling up the nominal value in accordance with the needs of the crown, while its intrinsic value grew steadily less. Money was called up or down according as the king was creditor or debtor, borrowing from the banks. It became increasingly customary from the 13th century to multiply new issues of money, the value of which became less and less each time. Money was continually being recalled, recast, and redistributed in a worse state than before. Lots of examples cited here in this book. And the princes generally provided the mint's plant and the equipment and hired the mint master. So they actually owned the means of producing commodity money. Minting was usually farmed out to the highest bidder, and the workforce coming from the privileged hereditary corporations whose members also held other jobs. It's obviously a very lucrative position. So this debasement of the precious metal within the monetary supply served as a substitution for taxation. So this means it's not an ideal substitute for taxation because you're not collecting the interest. You're just sort of making your money go farther. You're stretching your silver dollar, so to speak, rather than collecting more of it back. But rather than tax your subjects, you just change the value of their money. So as early as 1340, it was well understood that the debasement of the currency was very good for labor, fairly good for industry, merchants, and bad for landowner rents. This debasement raises rents. The debasement were brought to an end when landowners successfully promoted the writings of Nicholas Oresme, which condemned the process. Zarlenga writes, the prince's mixing of taxation with the money system slowed down, retarded the development of monetary thought, and creates the lasting impression that money is just a commodity. It doesn't have to be. Zarlenga points to another example called black money, monnaies noires. And so, along with the silver and gold coinage, we see this black money being circulated. And it was called black money because it was 95% copper with only about 5% silver, so it would turn black pretty quickly with age. And Zarlenga writes that this black money was used for small everyday transactions and was accepted in limited political jurisdictions within a city. Its issue was increased during the silver famine, when there was less famine. And Zarlenga writes that a lot more research is needed on this black money. Its importance may have been seriously underestimated by the tendency of earlier researchers to focus on the glitter of gold and silver. I think Zarlenga stops short of suggesting that this black money and monnaies noires is a possible form of nomisma, or sovereign currency by law. Nomisma just by common acceptance, the same way cigarettes can become accepted as a form of exchange within like POW camps, for example. Medieval moneylenders. This is where it gets a little technical. This is where the financing and the banking starts to come in. But we'll keep it simple. From the 10th to the 13th centuries, the papal collectors were the first Christian moneylenders. Rich monasteries also made loans, but from about 1200 onward, ecclesiastical establishments rarely lent money because they couldn't compete with the Knights Templars and eventually then the Italians. And then the church began enforcing a ban on usury after they lost control over the ability to profit off usury. So the Templars were the main holders of financial power in the 13th century because they tapped into that East-West gold-silver ratio. But they were suppressed in 1307, and that's when the field was opened up to the Italians. And they took over the double-entry bookkeeping techniques that the Templars learned during the Crusades. There were other private bankers as well. In the Catalonia region of Spain, things were not quite as good for bankers there. These bankers were private enterprises. They ran typical banking troubles, and they have very, very steep laws placed against them. No money charger who may fail, and none who has recently failed or in times past failed shall again keep a bank or hold any office under the crown. These bankers would get fired and wouldn't be allowed to work again if they messed up. And until he shall have satisfied all demands, he shall be detained on a diet of bread and water. And then there is an appendum added in 1321 in Catalonia to their banking regulations, which we might want to consider for our times. If no such settlement is made, the banker shall be proclaimed bankrupt and disgraced by the public crier in the places in which they failed and throughout Catalonia. They shall be beheaded, and their property shall be sold for the satisfaction of their creditors by the court. Neither we nor the Most High Heir Apparent nor our successors may pardon any money changers who have failed or may henceforth failed. And in 1360, banker Francesc Castello was beheaded in front of his bank. That was in Spain. Back to Italy. See the international merchants, bankers. There's different kinds of money lenders. There's different classes, smaller ones and bigger ones. But the Italian ones were the big international lenders. They're the only ones that made foreign investments in the 1300s. Their main lending mechanisms were bills of exchange and finance bills. They charging interest on riskless loans was generally forbidden by the church, but they had ways around that. There were merchants who needed to borrow and bankers who wanted to lend. They found semantic, verbal, jujitsu ways around the prohibition on usury by the church. And one method, a little tricky to understand, was to advance a sum in one city's coinage, guaranteed by a bill of exchange in a higher amount in another city's coinage, calling it a foreign exchange transaction rather than a loan. So it's a bill. It's kind of like a traveler's check. It gets post dated. So there's a difference in amount. A certain amount gets loaned, and then a certain amount gets paid. A bigger amount gets paid back. So think of it as a post-dated check. It's a check you write to be paid out at a further date with more interest. This becomes a defunct way of making a loan. It doesn't look like a loan, it just looks like a transaction. So the interest charge was contained in the difference between what was advanced and the amount paid back to be paid back later. And eventually these loans and repayments would just be done with bookkeeping entries. You wouldn't even need any silver or gold involved in the transaction. And this is a lot like a modern check. Just like a modern check, the bill has to include the name of the person to whom it's payable, the amount, the date that the loan was payable back, and the name of the institution the person who is paying. And between Florence and London, it would take 3 months to cash some of these checks. Between Florence and Bruges, 2 months. Between London and Bruges, 1 month. In the ancient world, a month to 3. Zarlenga writes that wasn't so bad when today can take a month to clear a check between Germany and Switzerland. So, again, this notion that the ancient world was disconnected, inefficient, and dark, and that we're so much more advanced now. Not at all. So the real strength of these Italian merchant bankers with their crazy post-dated checks to get around usury is their ability to trade finance with goods. They had solid partnership. They knew about seasonal patterns in trade, but they still had problems. There's still private banking abuses, people overextending themselves in loans, typically for war. When wars would go badly and people couldn't pay it back, things would become more unstable. Another class of moneylender that's important in this time period are the Lombards. And these people were almost as despised as the Jews. The Lombards were essentially pawnbrokers who made loans on pledges of personal property. They were found throughout Europe as tolerated rather than privileged. The Lombards took time deposits. They would hold on to things for a certain amount of time, and they would pay interest on them while using the capital for pawnbroking, and often going bankrupt on the ruin of small depositors, little pyramid schemes. And so these medieval pawn shops were an obvious place to fence stolen property. But the Lombards, this is the smallest scale of moneylender that exists. The bigger business exists in the local banking and in the bigger international banking, because they both figured out how to make money. This is the great discovery. This is the big social fact that arguably fuels colonization and fuels industrialization centuries before it started. This sets the stage for modern history. The discovery of bank money during the Renaissance wasn't just the classics that got rediscovered. It must have soon become apparent to the Templars, the Italian merchant bankers, and the great German lending houses that they possessed the power to create money in the form of bookkeeping credits on their books. Loans would not have to be made in coinage, but could be made in credits to a borrower's accounts at the bank. Just bookkeeping entries. Bookkeeping entry there. Once the clients got into the habit of conducting business with bills of exchange, with checks rather than actual coins, it became possible for the bankers to greatly multiply the apparent amount of money in circulation in the form of these credits. In many ways, this was a monetary power greater than the king's control over the mint. This bank money, which we still use today, was more a true fiat money form and further removed from crude barter than the precious metal coins. But the bankers were usurping a power that derives from and belongs to society, using that power for personal benefit. Bankers could charge interest on the loans they were making with money they created with a bookkeeping entry. So to charge interest on a loan extended out of debt. This is basically what we have now. To expect real money back for a loan that's based on nothing, that's based on debt, that's based on an expectation of other money owned. It's betting, hedging your bets. Bets upon bets. This drew goods and resources from society without contributing anything to society. This is the idea of usury. We use a society without giving anything back to it. The whole process of bank money was inflationary, but because it fraudulently pretended that the banker's paper was redeemable in metal, there's way more paper than metal, the system would collapse when too many bills had been written, and finally their coinage reserves would be drained away. This happens here too. We see bubbles popping. The housing bubble of 2008. There's so much money expected back. There's so many other loans and bets made on this money that's expected back, but never comes back because no one can afford to pay it back. And you see collapses. One could argue that this usurpation of society's money power at that time was justified. However, the evidence is that such bank money developed mainly where the supply of money was already abundant, so even in this case it's difficult to find justification for privately issued money. This type of banking business was growing dramatically in the late 1200s, and loans made by banks, mainly through overdrafts, far exceeded their capital and their deposits. So it's banks just making money out of paper, out of bookkeeping. But the only difference we have from today is that instead of books, it's digital books, it's Excel sheets. And our fearless leader, Sue Peterson from Greens for Monetary Reform, who put all this site together, she used to make money like this. And I think we'll do an interview with her sometime, specifically just on how money gets made out of bookkeeping entries online. Like literally, like how they actually make money. And so, despite all the problems encountered by the King's Mint, the city republics, and the city-owned banks, and the private bankers, these developments still represented a healthy decentralization and improvement from Byzantium's stifling hard money system just based on pure silver and gold. This is messed up and as unstable as this is, it still creates growth, it still creates new opportunities, even though it creates plenty of despair and destruction along the path. This circulation of new money in areas away from Constantinople still fueled industry and development, and some peasants would begin to purchase their own land. This basically ended the Dark Ages. But there's still some, it's not all good yet. This is Jacob Fugger. The Fuggers were a group of moneylenders from Germany, and they eventually surpassed the dominant Florentine Italian moneylenders. So in 1488, during the peak of Europe's silver famine, Fuggers got control of some silver mines through their family connections, and they got control of an mint in Augsburg, and they started making coins. The Fuggers started off with Hans Fugger, who was a weaver, who made a bunch of money. Then they started buying up silver mines in these mints. So they own the mines where they pull the raw metal out, and then they own the mint where they coin the metal. And from that, of course, the Fuggers, they probably made a lot of money off bank money. Of course they did. Fugger bills of exchange were considered as good as gold and actually became an article of current trade. The Fuggers were Catholics and were often involved in church finances as well. So they were involved in the pardoning tradition. So everywhere the pardoner Tetzel went, this was when they would sell forgivenesses for sins. They would forgive you if you pay money. This pardoner was accompanied by a Fugger representative with the key to the indulgence chest, and whenever it was full, the entire contents were paid to the Fuggers. They paid half of it to the curia and the other half went to their loan. This kind of business led to the Revelation. So the Fuggers were very unpopular, and they had the silence is golden, that was their motto, which survives to this day. They also left a more profane contribution to everyday English language. To Fugger meant to carry on in trade in general. In the unpopular mind, it had an evil connotation in the sense of usurious trade or sharp practices. And so, according to Ehrenberg, The fugger name is the source of the explicative term fucker. Fuck you, etc. There's a great documentary on the word fuck. I don't think they talked about fuggers. Moneylenders. Oh, technical difficulties, bear with us. Fuck! Right, the part where we talk about the fuggers and the appropriate word. The history of the explicative term we use when everything goes to hell comes from monetary history. We're almost at the end of this lecture. There's other moneylenders as well, like the Welsers, and these were the second largest German moneylenders. Their contribution to the English language is probably the word to Welsh on a debt. All these moneylenders, again, very unpopular people. There's certain awareness of this bank money and tendency to make loans just based off nothing and expect real money back. This culminated in a major currency monetary war. The big city where this battlefield played out was in Bruges. Zarlenga writes, the powerhouse of the north. It was the major trading capital of northern Europe. Bruges had three classes of moneylenders. Again, the Italian merchant bankers, the big ones, Lombard pawnbrokers, the lowest ones, who were eventually expelled from Bruges, along with their pawnbroking schemes. And the Italian merchant banks did both trading of actual goods and banking, just moving money around. And as bankers, they were not lending an interest, but were using the bill of exchange mechanisms to accomplish the same purpose. So the volume of their bills and exchange transactions of this bank money was a lot bigger than the volume of the actual merchandise in their trade. So they're learning how to just make money out of nothing at this point, which is what most companies in this country do. In Bruges, they was accustomed to pay for bills of exchange by transfers in bank rather than in coin. They would credit someone's account rather than pay out in coins, much as today when most checks are deposited, they are credited to one bank account rather than cash for actual currency. So again, it's just a virtual economy, not based on any actual hard money. This whole idea that we should return to a gold standard, I've heard that there's not enough gold in the world to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. There's not enough gold to be used by all the people of the world within as a form of currency. Similar thing happening in Bruges during the 1200s and 1300s. The Bruges moneylenders transferred funds from one client's account to another and also made transfers to clients of other money changers. To do this, every money changer kept an account with each of the other money changers, so everyone's keeping the same books. And these accounts could be debited or credited. And this type of non-centralized clearinghouse mechanism also existed in Genoa, Italy, around 1200 AD. Not everybody was down with this system. The Hanseatic League, this is a group of German merchants, a confederation of guilds, merchant guilds from central and northern Germany that dominated trade along the coast of northern Europe, peaked in 1450. And they were pretty hard negotiators, a lot of suppression of trade, blockage, famine, war. The Hansa in German means warrior bands, the word. And the members of the Hansas were actually towns, not necessarily merchants. They're guild towns. They would send cloth east, and then they would also silver and stuff they would get The luxury goods we talked about sent back west. And they'd set up, again, a lot of war. They would blockade Norway. So as rough as these traders were, they would use war, they would use famine, they would use all sorts of dirty tricks. But the one thing that this league was completely against was the use of credit. Ironically, like they'd rather kill than use credit. They could institute financial and economic regulations of all kinds, but they had no actual monetary powers. And they were very conservative. They were called the merchants of the Holy Roman Empire, and they had a strong bias against using credit in trade, and allowed no futures markets trading. No futures markets trading. No trading on future expected profit. So that things would go bad, and boom, you're in a bubble situation. They forbade selling herring, fish, before it was caught, and they forbade selling grain before it was grown, or cloth before it was woven. This attitude against futures markets was so strong that aspects of it survived until the early 1990s, when most futures contracts in Germany were not legally binding upon the speculator. Meaning you could bet on something if it didn't work out, it wasn't legally binding for the person who was speculating on the future trade. So this Hanseatic League that would use war and blockades and famine, but not credit, they went to war with the Italian war, financial war with the Italian merchants. And this happened in Bruges. So again, it's mostly between the Germans and the Italians. There's others involved with this, of course. But this was a struggle with the bankers for control of the money power, and this took the form of a war on credit. One of the oddest features of Hansa policy was that it thought it necessary to engage in a systematic campaign against credit on the grounds that it caused instability, prices, and would upset business. Credit was accused of increasing the temptation to take risks, and even worse of favoring the dishonest schemes of unscrupulous merchants, thus comprising the good name of the Hansa. They were alarmed by the Italians' command of credit, and so they managed to deflate Bruges. This epic struggle against credit raged on the battlefield of Bruges for 150 years, starting in 1389, when the House of Burgundy, who was working with the Hansa League, reacted to an extended inflationary period resulting from credit expansion, and they switched to a hard money policy, and that brought on severe deflation. Deflation meaning a lack of money in the economy. Zarlenga is always arguing about how deflations are more dangerous than inflation. Right now, we have an inflation of money. We have too much money in the economy, so our dollar is worth less in terms of what it can buy us. It's better to have too much money that's worth less than too little money circulating in a society, according to Zarlenga. And that's largely because trade and barter is a myth. As we see from David Graeber, there's no such thing as society without money. So, the benefits of this deflation, this lack of money circulating due to this credit struggle within Bruges, were the landed gentry, the clergy, the rentiers. Rents remain constant, even though there's less money in society. Just like rents remain constant here. Well, rents go up in our society. They remain constant back then, even though there's less money. But the renters are still, the rentier class is still making its money. The lower classes are getting squeezed harder. So Bruges was defaulting again in 1399. they're not able to make money anymore because their credit schemes are collapsing. And now's when the Hansa step in and demand the abolition of all credit transactions in Bruges and even in Flanders. They try to enforce the same policy in London, get rid of all credit, all bank money. In 1433, the city of Bruges suppressed all bankers, foreign and domestic. And they won, basically. So in Ordinance of 1489 gave the reason the banks have brought utter ruin among all classes of people, but especially among the merchants and persons of note. Next ordinance accused the bankers of all kinds of offenses against the Commonwealth, more specifically of pickling and culling the currency, sending bullion to foreign mints, and bringing the underweight monies of these mints into circulation. So, the Hanseatic League, kind of like the Andrew Jackson versus the Bank of the U.S. struggle during the 12 to 1300s, actually later than that, 1400s, right before we're starting to get to America. The Dukes of Burgundy and the Hanseatic League accurately describe certain aspects of the banker's credit creation activity, but nowhere do we find them correctly identifying this activity as usurping the monetary power of society. But these policies enforced by the Hanseatic League wreaked havoc on the bankers. In 1478, the Medicis sold out their Bruges branch to their partners. Other branches closed. Florence, throughout Italy as well. Machiavelli blamed the failure of these banks on the lack of discipline and attention, but their business tactics was generally worked in an inflationary environment. Bank money works better in an inflationary environment, not in a deflationary one. So the decline of Bruges, the Dukes of Burgundy and Hanseatic League won the battle, lost the war, much like Andrew Jackson won the battle against the Bank of the U.S. He shut it down. But then what? The larger bankers were international and moved. Again, new trade opportunities opened up. The rounding of the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope in 1503. Dukes of Burgundy, the Hanseatic League, moved from Bruges to Antwerp. Bruges goes into decline, the canal starts silting up, and Zarlenga writes that it is now a lovely city in Belgium, with many parks, colorful old canals, and very aggressive swans. And so the decline occurred even as the commercial dominance of Europe shifted from the Mediterranean to the North Sea during the Renaissance. And we're going to see how it's going to shift around a little bit more across the Atlantic starting soon. But that's all I've got for tonight. That was chapter 6. Next chapter, chapter 7, we're going to talk about the scholastics, some of the religious arguments that's popping up against usury during time of the Renaissance. So those are the cool ends of it. That's for next time. I'm exhausted. I must have been lecturing forever. How long have we been online?
Over an hour and a half almost.
Wow, cool. Well, hey, that was really useful for me. I learned a lot. Any questions, any comments, anything like that? Didn't think so. So long for now. Again, if you can afford to, please donate. Please support this work. You can do it at GoFundMe, A People Genealogy of Money. And again, thank you to all our donors who helped us so far. Dr. A.M.P. Zachar, who helped out with the last donation. Thanks a lot. I'm hoping to get my phone bill back up. Gonna need more money from everybody. Please keep spreading the word. Please spreading this history. There's money for all of us at the end of this home here, but but no need to go in that